Good afternoon. I am Gerald James, Professor of Economics and African American Studies here at Yale. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to what promises to be a stimulating and informative discussion. This event is the first of a series of programs this academic year marking the 50th anniversary of African American Studies at Yale. During the coming weeks, we will be hosting programs designed to examine the impact of the African American Studies Department on scholarship, community, and public life in the humanities, social sciences, and in the arts here at Yale, and more broadly with respect to both national and local public life. We will do this in an array of sessions outlined on the poster that is displayed at the entrance when you came into the church. Fortuitously, African American Studies' 50th anniversary coincides with the 400th anniversary of the 1619 purchase of 20 and odd Africans by the English colonists at Jamestown, Virginia. This being the case, we decided it most appropriate that our first program bring together renowned scholars to discuss this event and its meaning for both our long-gone ancestors as well as we Americans living today. Many people and organizations have participated in the development and/or sponsorship of this program. I cannot name them all, but I'm compelled to mention several. In the Department of African American Studies, Lisa Miller, Assistant to the Chair, Jasmine Williams, Operations Manager, our Chair, Jacqueline Goldsby, Professor of English and African American Studies, and Kobina Mercer, Professor of the History of Art and African American Studies. Risa Nelson, Assistant Dean of Yale College and Director of the Afro-American Cultural Center, which is also celebrating its 50th anniversary, will join us in some joint events later during the year. The Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration, and its director, Stephen Pitty, Professor of History and American Studies, the Department of History, the Office of Yale President Peter Salovey. Not least, our major co-sponsor of this particular event, the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition, whose staff, Michelle Zaks, Melissa McGrath, and Daniel Vera, have been instrumental in planning and executing today's event. This 400th anniversary is an occasion for both celebration and solemnity. We descendants and heirs of the 17th century Africans and Europeans who began this nation should celebrate the achievements made since 1619. But we also must face the brutal realities of 400 years of slavery, Jim Crow, and dilemmas of racial inequality that continue despite great progress on many fronts. In this regard, we also decided early during our planning that a location appropriate for recognizing the solemnity of this occasion would be the New Haven Green, a site that in centuries past was used as a slave mart where Africans and African Americans were bought and sold. Thus, we offer a special thanks to the Center Church on the Green, Reverend Kevin Ewing, and Sexton Michelle Reynard for making this beautiful venue available to us. As we are assembled in church, not coincidentally the first built in New Haven, it is appropriate that we begin our program with a brief blessing from Reverend Ewing. Afterwards, my esteemed colleague, David Blight, Professor of History, African American Studies, and Director of the Gilder Lehrman Center, will introduce our illustrious panel of conversationalists. Reverend Ewing.
Thank you, Dr. Yanis. I'll say we miss you at church Sunday. I'm going to hear about that later. Thank you. I'd like to welcome you all to First Church of Christ, New Haven Center Church on the Green. Our name is First Church of Christ because we were the first church established in the New Haven colony in 1639. We are an old church. We've been around for almost 400 years, almost the entire 400 years, 380 years. We've got a long history on both sides of slavery and the challenges that this country has faced around race. We have members of this church who were slave owners, pastors of this church who were slave owners. We've had a church, the African-American members of this church in 1820 were so tired of being forced to sit in the balcony here and at our sister congregational church next door that they left and started their own church, the Dixwell United Church of Christ, the first established African-American congregational church in the country. So out of something bad, God created something good. Dixwell neighborhood needed the Dixwell Church, just like the city of New Haven needs the Center Church. We are called Center Church because there are 3 churches on the green and we're the one in the middle. I have to explain that to people. I should have forgot you guys are from Yale. I shouldn't have had to explain that to you. This is also the church that just 5 years after the Dixwell congregation started and the African Americans left, brought in a young 23, 24-year-old pastor who came here and saw slaves being sold on the green across the street from this building and was so incensed by it that he started writing a series of tracts. Those tracts made their way to a young Abraham Lincoln, who read them and became friends with the Reverend Leonard Bacon at this church, and that is what led him to be an abolitionist and to be against slavery, such as he was. We are very happy to have you here today. This is still a working congregation. We meet every Sunday at 10 o'clock. I had to do that commercial. Come on out. There's plenty of room for all of you. If you have any questions about the church, you can see me, also our church historian and our sexton. Michelle is here as well. Let us pray. Spirit of life, Spirit of hope, Spirit of dreams, Spirit of love. As we gather today, commemorating this 400 years of trials and tribulations, of victories, of hope, as we celebrate the 50 years of study and understanding of the African-American race at Yale, God, we ask that you come and be a part of this conversation. Help us to remember the tragedies, the struggles. Help us to remember the victories, the progress, and help us to look forward and continue to move in the direction that you have set for us, a direction towards peace and togetherness, and most of all, love. Be with us this day and every day forward, and help us to remember that wherever we go, you are with us. Amen.
Thank you, Reverend Ewing. Thank you for the blessing. Thank you for allowing us to be here today. It's perfectly appropriate that we hold this commemoration in this church at this site. Something called New Haven has been here virtually as long as something called Jamestown. Not only were there slaves sold across there on the green, but that's where the Amistad captives were held at first in the courthouse and eventually where they exercised. It's rare in this country to commemorate, let's just generalize, our tragedies, the worst aspects of our history. We're very good at commemorating triumphs. Who isn't? We commemorate emancipation. We don't commemorate slavery. We like endings if we can narrate those endings in a sufficient way to make us commemorative. We were talking at the group of us, this incredible panel you're going to hear from just earlier, about what is it about this moment that makes it possible? Is it just because we have a 19th anniversary? What is it about this moment we're living, not just the Trump moment, but a longer moment maybe, that makes it possible finally to talk so seriously about slavery in public ways, not just in pedagogy, not just in scholarship, which we've been doing for generations? This panel is going to tell you all the answers to that. Good luck. I too want to thank everybody who pulled this together in the FM department, Lisa Bowman, my staff at the GLC, Michelle, Melissa, Daniel, for all your work you've done on this. Jerry, you really did all the work on this, all the conception of this. And Jackie Goldsby, our current chair in FM. Jerry was the chair last year. This comes out of a long-term planning of the 50th anniversary of FM, and now the 400th of the 16, 19, 20-odd Negroes, as they were called in that letter, which probably were 30, we're learning. It probably was an English ship and not a Dutch ship. It may have been English because they were avoiding being accused of piracy. I don't know. They're all, historians love to fuss about the details of what really this was. We can't help ourselves. We won't do too much of that, I don't think. But before I introduce the panel, and I'm going to do it quickly, I want to take us to two places in the history of African American poetry. One, I suppose, is an example of the darkness of this story, the solemnity of this story, and the incredible voice of Robert Hayden. This is just the opening of his great poem, Middle Passage, which runs for 6 or 7 pages. This is just the opening. Jesus, Estrella, Esperanza, mercy, sails flashing to the wind like weapons, sharks following the moans, the fever and the dying, horror the corpuscent and compass rose, middle passage, voyage through death to life upon these shores. 10 April 1800, blacks rebellious, crew uneasy. Our linguist says their moaning is a prayer for death, ours and their own. Some try to starve themselves, lost 3 this morning, leaped with crazy laughter to the waiting sharks, sang as they went under. Desire, adventure, Tartar, and the good ship Anne. Standing to America, bringing home black gold, black ivory, black seed. Deep in the festering hold thy father lies. Of their bones New England pews are made. Those are the altar lights that were his eyes. Hayden had a New England church in mind, obviously, when he wrote the beginning of that poem. In the early 1930s. This is also a 1930s poem by Margaret Walker. You may know Margaret Walker mostly as a fiction writer. The famous novel Jubilee. She also wrote a lot of poetry. And I thought I'd just read a few verses of this poem, not because it's happier, but because it has a different angle of vision on this story about survivors. It's called For My People. For my people everywhere singing their slave songs repeatedly, their dirges and their ditties and their blues and their jubilees, praying their prayers nightly to an unknown God, bending their knees humbly to an unseen power. For my people lending their strength to the years, to the gone years and the now years and the maybe years, washing, ironing, cooking, scrubbing, sewing, mending, hoeing, plowing, digging, planting, pruning, patching, dragging along, never gaining, never reaping, never knowing, and never understanding. For the cramped, bewildered years, we went to school to learn, to know the reasons why and the answers to, and the people who, and the places where, and the days when, in memory of the bitter hours when we discovered we were black and poor and small and different, and nobody cared, and nobody wondered, and nobody understood. For my people thronging 47th Street in Chicago and Lenox Avenue in New York and Rampart Street in New Orleans, lost, disinherited, dispossessed, and happy people, filling the cabarets and taverns and other people's pockets, needing bread and shoes and milk and land and money and something to call their own. For my people walking blindly, spreading joy, losing time, being lazy, sleeping when hungry, shouting when burdened, drinking when hopeless, tied and shackled and tangled among ourselves by the unseen creatures who tower over us omnisciently and laugh. Let a new earth rise. Let another world be born. Let a bloody peace be written in the sky. Let a people loving freedom come to growth. Let a beauty full of healing and strength of final clenching be the pulsing in our spirits and our blood. Let the martial songs be written. Let the dirges disappear. Let a race of men now rise and take control. I think arguably all true hope, a true sense of hope, is probably born out of tragedy. Just something to think about. Okay, quickly, I'm going to introduce this great panel. They'll take over, and Jerry and I will get out of the way. First, our moderator, Ed Rugemer, my colleague in history and African American studies. He teaches in both departments. He was tenured some 3 years ago or more. I forget now. He's the author of 2 very distinguished books, both prize winners, The Problem of Emancipation, Caribbean Roots of the American Civil War, which won 3 book prizes. I won't name them all, but they're all important book prizes, I can assure you. His brand new book, just been out a year, called Slave Law and the Politics of Resistance in the Early Atlantic World, has already won 2 book prizes. The Gustav Ranas Prize from the Macmillan Center here at Yale for International History, and the World History Association Bentley Book Prize for the best book in world history. Ed will be our moderator. Stephanie Smallwood is coming back to Yale. She did her master's degree here in AFAM in 87 to 89. She did her PhD at Duke. She is the author of many works, many articles. She's a tremendous player in public history circles. She has helped us at the GLC in a number of ways, not least of which was 7 or 8 years ago. I'm forgetting the numbers now. We did a teacher institute for teachers from Ghana, the UK, and the US, and Stephanie co-taught that seminar at Kokrobiti in Ghana, at the University of York in England, and here at Yale in New Haven with teachers from all 3 countries. She co-taught it with James Walvin from England. She's especially the author of the book Saltwater Slavery, a middle passage from Africa to the American diaspora, which won the Frederick Douglass Book Prize, which we sponsor here at Yale. It was not an inside job, it's an outside jury. In I think 08 or 09, somewhere in there. And she is now at work on a big book, a big diasporic book entitled Africa in the Atlantic World, a Geopolitical History of Colonial Slavery and Racial Capitalism. I didn't ask when it's done or coming out or anything, so I don't know is the answer. And finally, no, not finally, Brenda Stevenson, our other Yale grad who's come back, indeed 2 or 3 Yale degrees as I count them, her PhD here, her 2 MAs, 1 in African American Studies and 1 in History. She holds an endowed chair, the Nicole Family Endowed Chair at UCLA. She's been the chair of the UCLA History Department. She's been a very distinguished participant in public history of all kinds, in media of all kinds. There are a lot of historians out there these days trying to help people understand the world we live in. And she's the author of 2 very distinguished books, one entitled Life in Black and White, Family and Community in the Slave South, in 1996, and now a second book, The Contested Murder of Latasha Harlins, Justice, Gender, and the Origins of the LA Riots. That's already won the James Rowley Prize of the Organization of American Historians, and I think at least 2 other prizes. Brenda, welcome back. And finally, James Horn. Jim is the president and CEO of the Jamestown Rediscovery Project, or also sometimes called Historic Jamestown. He at one point served as president of research at Colonial Williamsburg. He also ran the research operation at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello in another stint, and he taught for 20 years at the University of Brighton in England. He's a leading expert on early Virginia, 17th century Virginia in particular, and he's the author of at least these 2 important works, A Land as God Made It, Jamestown and the Birth of America, and then most recently, 1619, Jamestown and the Forging of American Democracy. This is our panel. They're going to have at it about the history of this 1619 and the origins of slavery, and bring it up into the present, where we can talk about legacies of this problem, wherever that takes us. So, panel, it's all yours.
Thank you, David, for those introductions, and thank you all for coming out for this very important conversation. I'd like to begin by talking about the history at stake in 1619 and what actually happened and what that means, and then we can move on into the legacies, the question of what does it mean to commemorate the beginnings of slavery and what becomes the United States. What does that mean to us today? And I want to start with those 20-odd Africans, those people who had lives in Africa before they found themselves on a slave ship in the Chesapeake Bay. And I want to turn to you, Stephanie Smallwood, first. You've written a wonderful book on the transatlantic slave trade that I assign to my undergraduates every year. And can you put that world in context for us? What happened to them?
I can try. First, before I do that, I do want to just, I want to say what an honor it is to be invited to come back to what is an important home for me. I actually pulled out my phone. I'm a historian, which means I'm terrible at actual math, so I used the calculator to remind myself exactly how many years ago it was that I, at this time of year, the fall, the beginning of an academic year, that I started my academic career as a grad student in AFAM. It was 32 years ago. And it was really special to be invited to come back here by Jerry Janes, because I still remember very clearly my first graduate seminar here, taught by the DGS of AFAM, and it was a brilliant economist named Jerry Janes. So yeah, it's special to be here. and I want to thank everyone involved in putting this together. What I'm going to do very briefly is try to contextualize 1619. 1619, a Portuguese ship called the São João Bautista arrives off the coast of Luanda in present-day Angola, intending to receive a cargo of African captives and transport them to the Spanish-American colonial port of Veracruz in Mexico. With 350 captives aboard, the ship begins an invariably deadly voyage across the Atlantic. 40% of the captives have died by the time the ship enters the waters of the Caribbean Sea, where the ship is interdicted by 2 English privateers, vessels lurking there with the express intent to attack Spanish or Portuguese ships and pilfer from whatever cargo they have on board. In this case, the 2 English privateers see value in the São João Bautista's human cargo. About 50 to 60 captives are put aboard the English ship called the Treasurer, and then half of these are transferred to the other of the 2 English ships called the White Lion. The São João Bautista resumes its journey now with a cargo of 147 captives. Conditions aboard are so dire, the captain decides to stop at Jamaica, where a ragtag Spanish colonial presence means an opportunity to replenish supplies of fresh water and food. 24 boys out of the ship's human cargo are given over in exchange for said items, and what remains of the human cargo is transferred to yet another vessel, this one called the Santa Ana. Now that vessel completes the final leg of the slaving voyage begun by the São João Bautista, reaching Veracruz in August of 1619, where the remaining 123 captives are delivered to Spanish colonial officials. But what about the 2 English privateers, the Treasurer and the White Lion? There were 2 English colonizing projects taking shape in the Circumcaribbean in the early 17th century, one on the island of Bermuda, the other, of course, being the settlement that presumed to possess the lands inhabited by the Algonquian peoples and ruled by their paramount chief, Powhatan. At the center of their world was the wide, deep-water bay they called the Chesapeake, and the 4 great rivers, the Powhatan, the Pamunkey, the Rappahannock, the Patawomac, that gave the region its distinctive geography. English colonial cartography would appropriate some Algonquian place names and erase others, calling the entire region after the mythic virginity of England's Queen Elizabeth I and projecting the name of England's King James I onto both the southernmost of the great rivers and the settlement the English established on its banks. I'm, of course, referring here to what English colonial cartography calls Virginia, the James River, and Jamestown. In August of 1619, the White Lion entered what I'm going to call by its Algonquian name, the Powhatan River, with its contingent of the human cargo seized from the São João Bautista, the now infamous 20 and odd, brought ashore at Point Comfort. They would be followed shortly thereafter by several more aboard the Treasurer. Thus were some 350 Angolans dispersed across the Atlantic, almost half to reside in death in the ocean depths, the rest conscripted to the dispossession and colonization of American indigenous lands, 24 boys to reside in enslavement to Spanish colonists on the island of Jamaica, 100 and more enslaved in colonized Mexico, at least 20, and recent research suggests probably closer to 30, joined to the English colonizing project that undid the dominion of the Powhatan Confederacy, and what was left of any remaining survivors ultimately consigned to enslavement on Bermuda. I didn't tell that part of the story, but that was the fate of some aboard the Treasurer. The 350 Angolans forced to board the São João Bautista in the year 1619 were living out what had become a familiar pattern in the preceding 4 decades or so. Since establishment of a Portuguese colony at Luanda in 1576, communities across the West Central African kingdoms of Congo and Ndongo increasingly fell victim to both civil conflicts and outright campaigns of predation. A steady stream of local residents turned captive casualties of war met a steady stream of Iberian and increasingly also English or Dutch vessels arriving to receive them as human cargo. The voyage of the São João Bautista was one among nearly 1,000 voyages that removed an estimated 330,000 captives from West Central Africa to the Americas from 1576 to 1625. comprising about 85% of the slaving traffic in this foundational half-century of transatlantic slaving, that reflect the region's role as the traffic center of gravity, a tragic status the region would retain for the next 100 years. They were shipped to ports that anchored an Iberian field of colonizing across the Circumcaribbean: Bahia, Pernambuco, and Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, Santo Domingo, Puerto Rico, Havana, and the Caribbean islands, and Cartagena and Veracruz on the South and Mesoamerican mainlands. And now, with an emerging English effort to join the colonizing project, Virginia and Bermuda, Barbados and other territories colonized by the English settlers soon to follow as the 17th century unfolded. The arrival of the 20-and-odd aboard the White Lion has the random distinction of being an event about which we know a fair amount because of the documentary records it generated and their archival preservation. But this almost certainly was not the first time a European ship had entered the Powhatan River carrying Africans as captives. I say this because we know that a muster taken in March of that year reported, quote, 32 Negroes, quote, in the service of several planters. And we can acknowledge that African men were employed as crew aboard Iberian voyages of exploration and conquest, and also aboard Iberian slaving vessels. But we also have to acknowledge that it was in the cargo holds of slave ships, and there exclusively, that Africans crossed the Atlantic in ever large numbers in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. And we have to acknowledge additionally that Europeans relegated captive Africans to a singular purpose in the inter-imperial colonizing project. They were there to be exchanged. Other than death, the only way captive Africans departed European ships to come ashore in strange American lands was by economic transaction. English colonizing in the Americas was in its infancy in 1619, and as yet there was no formalized English colonial market for slaves. There was no formal commercial network linking African ports of departure and English-American ports of arrival for slave ships. But the English privateers expected that if they made their way to the mouth of the Powhatan River, the Africans they held would be received as valuable commodities, and the English colonists did not disappoint. There is no sense of confusion or hesitancy in the reports and letters that record the event. There is no, not sure what to do here, or why would you think we'd be willing to receive these Africans in exchange for something else of value? To the contrary, the transaction is remembered as an easy one. The ship, quote, sold us 20 niggers, end quote, is the simple declarative statement from Captain John Smith in his General History of Virginia. Quote, he brought not anything but 20-and-odd Negroes, end quote, John Rolfe famously wrote of the White Lion, suggesting that this was not especially impressive, yet he continues thus, which the governor and Cape merchant bought for victual at the best and easiest rate they could. There was no hesitation, no refusal. The English colonists knew what to do when presented with an opportunity to transact in captive Africans. The Atlantic in the early 17th century was a zone of inter-imperial colonizing that was producing a new kind of slavery, a colonial slavery, that made people into units of abstract economic value to be used up and expended in whatever wealth-producing enterprise European colonizing projects could dream up. People as currency to facilitate economic exchange, people as labor to be consumed in the production of items for economic exchange. First in the mines that stripped the Caribbean islands of surface deposits of gold ore and extracted mineral wealth from the depths of mainland mountainsides. On the emerging horizon in the fields of sugar and tobacco and rice and indigo and coffee cultivation that together with indigenous dispossession would make the Circumcaribbean into a vast engine of racial capitalist accumulation. These were the twin tools of settler colonial terror across the hemispheric Americas, and the story of 350 Angolans, whose dispersal across the Atlantic in 1619 produced the 20-and-odd we remember today, can and should be told through these dual lenses that reveal both the figure of the Indian and the figure of the Negro, both dispossessed of belonging to indigenous lands and both enslaved by the long and as yet unfinished histories of settler colonialism. Our great challenge as we commemorate the 20-and-odd is to tell a story of the African American that does not reproduce erasure of the story of the indigenous American, as we also struggle with the reverse, how to tell the story of the Indigenous American without erasing the story of the African American. Thank you.
Thank you. I wonder if we could go, if we can speculate about the lives of those 350 in their lives in Africa. How did they become enslaved? How did they end up being for sale on the coast in this port in Angola?
Most likely as war captives, whether that be as a result of civil conflicts in the Congo Kingdom or the result of the predations that were really beginning to take shape as the Portuguese were colonizing in Luanda.
And how long had this been going on?
Well, as I said, it really picks up in right after the Portuguese established the colony. So the 1576 is a real turning point. It really is in the last quarter of the 16th century that this thing really picks up. And I think it's not a stretch to argue that were it not for the Portuguese colonizing in Luanda, whether there was going to be a transatlantic slave trade is an open question. I guess is my point, that there's just no mistaking the centrality of what happens in West Central Africa in the last quarter of the 16th century. That is the kind of the engine that starts this thing going.
And what about the English? Are the English involved in the slave trade at this point, or?
Well, again, the English are observing, and this is the point I'm trying to make here, that the English understand that there's been 150 years of slave trading going on when they come into the Atlantic arena, and they understand that one of the best ways to get in on this colonizing project is to interdict into the slave trade. They do so initially as privateers because they really don't have much of a means to really develop their own slave trade yet. But once they have English colonies, of course, that's what's on the horizon.
Right. Well, let's turn our attention to Jamestown and Professor Horn. Jim, what had happened in Jamestown up to this point? The colony begins in 1607. That's fairly well known, but so it's only 12 years. I mean, what had happened? What had happened in the colony up to that point?
Sure, yeah. I think the best way to characterize the first phase of development of Virginia is one of continual struggle. This is a really rough time, both for the English colonizers and also for the indigenous peoples, the Powhatans. And it's a struggle for survival in several ways. One is there are severe food shortages. People often ask me, how can that be? They're situated right by the James River, the Powhatan, as it was called by Indian peoples. Couldn't they fish, or couldn't they hunt game, or the wild fowl? But at times they simply didn't have enough resources to capture or fish and feed themselves. So the first period is one of trying to develop enough supplies, trying to negotiate with Indian peoples. Indian peoples were important to the English for two reasons, mainly. One was for food, and the other was for information, because the English are looking for, if I can put it this way, the pearl and the gold. They haven't come to grow tobacco, nor have they come to grow English crops, for the very good reason you can grow those in England. So what they're trying to do is a kind of Spanish version in North America, English style, which is to say they were looking for gold and silver mines, other precious mines in the mountains, in the interior. They were looking for a river passage through the mountains that would take them to the other side of the continent. So this vision of Virginia, which was a commercial company, when we think about early colonies, we might see this as being sponsored by the Crown. It was certainly there was certainly permission given by James I to set up Virginia, but it was a for-profit company. It was the Virginia Company of London, and it was to make money. And the best way of making money, as far as investors are concerned, is quickly. So the failure to generate profit in these early years put a real strain on the colonists and the colony itself, which nearly failed several times. And I might add, there's nothing unusual about that. Most European colonies in America were lost. They were lost colonies. Most didn't survive more than 6 to 12 months. Whether you look at Spanish, French, English, Dutch even, they don't last very long. So Virginia and Jamestown are rather unique in being able to survive. They only just about managed it via martial law, that was a brutal regime for the English colonists. And that really was the background to the changes that took place later. So perhaps the main point to take away from this is this is not a plantation society early on. There's no need for large numbers of bound laborers, whether indentured servants or enslaved peoples, Indian or African, at this time. This is a kind of transitional moment in the development of English society in America.
Mm-hmm. Why then did it make sense for them to buy these Africans when the opportunity emerged? I mean, what did they do?
Well, I think as Stephanie was saying, the English were very well aware of the scale of the Atlantic slave trade, and it is I would venture to say, Stephanie might disagree, but I'm going to take the chance anyway, that the slave trade was the engine of the entire Atlantic commercial system from the early, certainly from the mid-16th century, if not earlier, through to the period we're dealing with. The English were well aware of this. There were already enslaved Africans in Bermuda, and there would be others in the Atlantic islands. The English wanted in on the trade, but they were really nibbling at the edges of it, picking up Angola ships, as they were called, as best they could by privateering. So they well knew the value of Africans, and I think when they arrived, when the 20 and odd, probably, as you mentioned, nearer 30 and odd, arrived in August and early September of 1619, they were only too keen to buy them. And the two men that bought them, Sir George Yardley, the governor, and the Cape merchant, Abraham Piercy, were the wealthiest men in the colony at that time, and they remained that way for the rest of their lives, which wasn't that long, but nevertheless, they were already invested in slavery. If they could have got more, they would have had more, no question in my mind.
And they put them to work on farms? Like, what did they physically do when they arrived? I mean...
Well, by 1619, tobacco was taking off. Land had been stolen from the Powhatans, possessed by the English, taken from the Powhatans, all along the James River Valley. So there's an enormous expansion of English settlement from Jamestown, both downriver towards the Capes, Kecoughtan, and upriver towards some of the settlements there, near Richmond today. And this tobacco was proving to be a very valuable crop. The Virginia Company hated it. They thought it was just a fad. And of course, James I famously was opposed to it because he thought it actually did harm to people. But for that said, tobacco was very popular in the English taverns. It was cheaper than the hitherto Spanish tobacco, and getting it from Virginia on the London markets reaped great profits for the planters. So there was the opportunity for initially indentured servants, poor white people, the unemployed and underemployed coming out of the cities, primarily London, aged anywhere from maybe 9 or 10, just boys and girls, off the streets of London, all the way up to 20s and maybe late 20s. Very few greybeards in early Virginia. So the Africans would have been put to work alongside the white indentured servants on these very early tobacco plantations.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Brenda, if we could bring you into the conversation as well. How did Africans and the English, how did they get along? What did the society look like? Did they intermingle? I mean, at first they were working in the same fields, doing the same thing, but what distinguishes the experience of African people in this period, okay, and these indentured servants?
Well, I'm going to get to that question.
Yeah.
I do want to begin by also thanking Jared James for inviting me. I am a product of AFAM, African-American Studies at UCLA. I'm at UCLA, at Yale, and also the History Department at Yale. And so it's always wonderful to be back here, and I'm particularly invested in the 50th anniversary. I think it's marvelous that the department is thriving, that it is now a department, that we continue to educate, that we continue to inform the world, and that we continue to train magnificent young scholars to go out and to grapple with these problems. So thank you very much for having me here, particularly on this occasion. I also am happy to be here because I'm from Virginia, and I'm from a place that is less than 20 miles away from Point Comfort, where these Africans arrived. And so I grew up, I guess, in the shadow and the sunshine of what happened in that August of 1619. So it's very interesting for me to be here and to be talking about this. Now to get to your question, which is how did they get on? Actually, Africans and indentured white servants got on fairly well. They got on so well that the new legislature, I guess, the General Assembly wasn't even called that in 1619, but was established in 1619, had to start passing laws that said not to get along, which said, indeed, you cannot intermingle socially, you cannot marry, you cannot have sex, you cannot do any of the things that the people obviously were doing, because otherwise there would not have been any laws about it. And we began to see, pretty early on, also, if you look at the case of Elizabeth Key, for example, 1660, it was a mulatto woman whose mother was African, whose father was English or Turkish, or, it's still being disputed, but who was not African and was not black, going to court and suing for her freedom because of her white free father. So there was a lot of intermingling. We see it also in of course, those persons who absconded, those persons who ran away to try to find their freedom. Oftentimes it was as groups of people who were, I guess, thought that they had a lot in common because of their status as unfree people, whether or not they were indentured or were enslaved at the time. And so we see also a lot of social life together in grog shops and in the small towns like Williamsburg that were first developing, happening too. We also see some Africans who are participating in Christian life at the time, and some whites who are participating in the religions of indigenous Africans. So there is a lot of intermingling that's going. I mean, they're certainly of a similar class, okay, and they work together, they play together, and they arrive, not together, but at about the same time and at the same ports. And some of the ways in which indentured servants are treated, whether they're white or African or Creole, are quite similar. And so in that way, they too had a lot in common,
Your comments started off by talking about laws passed by the Assembly to to penalize whites and blacks for intermingling. Why is it in the interest of the legislature to do that? I mean, people are intermingling, kind of organically. And then it seems like what you're saying is the legislature steps in and makes an effort to divide. Why? Why is that happening?
Well, part of it has to do with class, which is quite important during the time period. Much more important here than, much more important at that time than it is now. But there were very few white elite, such as Pearson, for example, and the governor, and Yardley, and they needed workers. They needed black workers, white workers, indigenous workers, and it's pretty clear early on that in order to control the workforce, which was much larger than the elite landholders were at the time, that they had to find some way to separate them. And so that was part of the initiative of passing these laws. But there also were laws as we begin to see a separation, or legal separation of status of being black and European or white or indigenous. There were questions about the children born into the colony, that is the peopling of the colony, and whether or not these peoples who were being born there were going to be free or unfree, And so we see in 1662, for example, this law is passed saying that you will take the status of your mother, whereas in English common law, if the people were married, you would take the status certainly of your father. And so we begin to, see these distinctions being made between the two groups in law, and some clarification being drawn to that. And with that clarification is the notion of difference, and with difference, division. Again, division would help to keep the elites in power because they don't have a large group of people, the majority of the people who are worker bees, coming together. You also see 1676, Bacon's Rebellion. You will see, landless or small landed people combining with some, people who were either free blacks or enslaved and fighting together, which is also a frightening moment for the elites at the time, too. So that's I think those are the basic reasons why you begin to see this placed in law. But you also, as Professor Smallwood has indicated, Virginia does not operate out, alone, independently. It's part of the British colonial project at the time. So you begin to see these laws, such as the Barbadian Slave Code of 1661, that has great impact on South Carolina, but also on Virginia. It's part of an empire in which people moved from one place to the other. They established plantations in Virginia and also in Jamaica and also in Barbados and later on in South Carolina, et cetera. So it's not just what's going on in the colony of Virginia at the time. It's also what's going on in the rest of the British Atlantic, French Atlantic, Spanish, Portuguese Atlantic, Dutch Atlantic at the same time.
Right. What about indigenous people? Are indigenous people enslaved alongside Africans at this point? Or what is, into the Virginia colony? Or are they able to stay away in some way? How does...
Well, indigenous people are enslaved from the very beginning. People are captured, they're taken back to England as, parts of exhibitions. They are captured to get information from them. They are captured to exchange, to learn the languages of the people. So from the very beginning of contact, there is this kind of snatching of indigenous people and enslaving them. It doesn't really come into Virginia law until 1667, but remember that's the same decade that you see all these other laws coming into play too. 1661, 1662, 1667, and supposedly also the General Assembly decides in 1705, I believe, that indigenous people should not be enslaved. But who's going to free them? Except for other indigenous people who may attack, farms to plantations and get their, get people back. And you don't really, again, a law is really passed again in 1777. But then indigenous people, even at that point, have to sue for their freedom before they just can't, walk away, or people will try to reclaim them. And again, we're talking about the frontier. Okay, so the frontier, you may have a law, whether or not that law is applied, enforced. I try to explain it to my students like this. What's the speed limit on campus? They say 15 miles an hour. And I say to them, how many of you go 15 miles an hour? And none of them raise their hand. So if they see, a UCPD on the corner, they slow down. Okay, but laws are like that. I mean, we often try to gauge what history is like by looking at the laws. And that is a good gauge to a certain extent. At least we can think about why the laws were formed, or what ideally the society meant, or what were the pernicious reasons for these particular laws. But it doesn't mean the laws were enforced, or enforced fully, or enforced all the time.
Can I just interject there? 'Cause
Please.
I think that's a great point, and I think we also want to remember that, because we have so few records, we rely on the legal record because it's one of the few bodies of documentary material that we have about this period. But I think, as Professor Stevenson is saying, we want to remember not to make the mistake of thinking that when we see a law, that's when we're seeing something happening. In other words, you don't need a law in order to enslave someone. You need power. And when you have people who are 3,000 miles from home on a slave ship, you have the power. A lot of the laws are English colonists talking to one another. White colonial men talking to each other. Elite white men talking to each other about how are we going to handle the problem of when some of us have children by an African woman.
Right, exactly, right.
What are we going to do about how we understand power relationships? Elizabeth Key doesn't get to come to the court, except by the patronage.
Exactly, of a white elite man.
An indigenous person doesn't get to come to the court to sue for their freedom because they don't have the standing to appear before the court because they're indigenous. And I also want us to make sure we remember that, there is an extensive slave trade in indigenous people that the English are involved in. There's a tremendous, and we're learning more and more about this. There's a lot of scholarship that's going to be coming out in the coming years about how much English colonists are capturing indigenous people and sending them to the Caribbean. So we need to stop assuming that when we say slave trade, that we necessarily always mean an African person and the transatlantic slave trade between Africa and the Americas. Increasingly, I think what we need to be able to do is to talk about the ways in which slavery, captivity, property in people, trafficking in people is something that really, really is touching on both Africans and indigenous peoples of the Americas. It is a dispossession, a disruption of indigenous belonging on both sides of the Atlantic.
I just to add along to that, when I try to explain this to my students about indigenous people being captured and shipped all over the Atlantic world, I say to them, you remember the Salem witch trials? And they say yes. And I say to them, you remember Tituba? And they say, yes. And I say, where is she from? And they say, Africa. And I say, no. Then they say, Barbados. And I said, oh, somebody knows something. But I said, before Barbados. And she's an indigenous person who comes from South America, the coast of South America. And it's then sold to Barbados, and then is brought from Barbados by her owners there to Massachusetts. And so they say, oh, really? I thought it was just Africans who were, or indigenous people from North America. And I said, no, these people are being traded all over this region, and resold and given to somebody else and gifted to this person or sold to this person or abandoned to this person, et cetera, et cetera.
I wonder if we could follow the society forward in time a little bit. How does Virginia and Maryland, this Chesapeake region, can we talk about the expansion of slavery in this period? What is driving that? Does the slave trade continue into this area? I mean, it does, but
oh yeah.
We're going to talk about that.
Does the slave trade continue?
Oh, wow.
I believe everyone in this room knows that it does. What we're looking at, again, in the moment of 1619, it's the beginning of something that is going to grow exponentially over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries. Yeah.
I think that that's absolutely right. But I think what distinguishes, say, the Chesapeake area from the West Indies, if you were to be looking at the Maryland, Virginia in mid-17th century, you might find there's perhaps about 1,500 enslaved people working in both colonies, somewhere around there. Maybe a little less, actually. But if you looked at the British West Indies, and even more so the Spanish West Indies, if you were looking at societies in Middle and South America, both Spanish and Portuguese, there you would find tens of thousands of enslaved peoples working. So in the 17th century, and this is particularly significant in terms of what we're going to be talking about with regard to 1619 and the evolution of the representative government in Virginia and English America. In the 17th century, the main labor base through at least to the 1670s, maybe 80s, is white. Mm-hmm. It's indentured. It's what I was saying about these poor people going from England, tens of thousands of those. So great is the emigration from England in this period, somewhere between the 1620s and the 1660s and 70s. So great is it that the English population actually dips. I mean, there's a decrease in the population, and that continues for quite some time, even into the 18th century. So there's an enormous movement of poor English whites thinking that it's kind of like a lottery. Maybe you strike it rich, most don't, but there's maybe a chance you would. And that's what's fueling the expansion of the tobacco industry in Maryland and Virginia, and in the West Indies, through to at least the English West Indies, through to the sugar revolution of the 1640s and 50s. Again, it's mainly white labor, and thereafter enslaved African labor takes over. So there's different. It's an obvious point, really, but there are quite clear different. It's quite clear there are these different rates of growth of enslaved labor.
You alluded to this moment in 1619, and I still find it remarkable that within a few weeks, the first Africans arrive in Jamestown, and the first General Assembly meets. So it's as if slavery and democracy are emerging simultaneously in this moment. What do we do with that history?
Well, I think that there has been a good deal of commentary about that coincidence. And famously, I think Edmund Morgan has talked about the American paradox at the heart of the founding of American society, that freedom was born at the same time as slavery, and they came into the world together at the same time as far as America is concerned. But and I think it is a way of pointing to these different trajectories in colonial development. After all, the General Assembly, self-government, was self-government for white people, i.e. the English. Indian peoples had their own jurisdictions, their own laws, and I think only in terms of policing and controlling Africans initially at least, did laws, English laws, relate to, and I'm talking about the very early period, the 1620s, not the later period, but English laws weren't meant to protect Africans. So this is an exclusionary approach, if you like. So there are these different developments going on simultaneously, just as, for example, one model of colonization was setting up a pirate base, which had been around for at least half a century, that concept. So Walter Raleigh, for example, at Roanoke, they were thinking about setting up a privateering base that would prey on Spanish shipping. If you can't find the gold in the mountains, in them there hills, it's floating on the ocean in the plate ships, the treasure ships of the Spanish and Portuguese, so why not go there instead? So Bermuda, at this time, in 1620, is described as an Algiers, as a pirate-infested society, whereas Virginia, at least by 1619, is seen as potentially a new and improved kind of English society. So these different approaches to the colonial model, and slavery is being fitted into these various models.
Mm-hmm. But I think also, one of the things that observing this coincidence allows us to do is to ask ourselves, to be careful not to romanticize democracy, right? Because I think when we think of democracy, we think not just of representative government, but we think of something that's meant to promote a kind of equality, of opportunity, and what this coincidence reminds us of is that the conditions of possibility for this initial experiment in some kind of representative government is one that is deliberately meant to be representative government for a very, very select, small few. That depends on the violent dispossession and enslavement of a whole lot of others.
Exactly.
So that means we have to ask tough questions about democracy, right? And not just sort of create a teleology where we're kind of already figuring 1619 as the inevitable beginning of the unfolding of, the wonderful American experiment, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's the tough question that the coincidence, requires us to ask, particularly given what we know to be, the legacies that we are living with right now, right? So, yeah.
And I'd like to add that, even if we look at the way in which these indentured servants were treated, white indentured servants and black indentured servants as well, they were treated very poorly. And so, I can't emphasize more how elitist this first assembly was. I mean, they were the richest people in the colony. They were all males, of course. They were all white, of course. And when we talk about indentured white servants, we can't forget the fact that many of these people were convicts. Okay, they were convicts. They were given a choice: be transportation or prison for the rest of their life, or hanging for the rest of their lives, which is a very short period of time at that time. So, so these people were forced into these kinds of, to coming to the colonies. Some of them wanted to come, but land distribution was very slow in coming to be. Very few people could get land. Those people, very early on, who could get land started to monopolize it. And so the government, we see it as the beginning of democracy, but we see it, if we look at it, and it is, but it's the beginning of our democracy, and the kinds of limits that we still see on our democracy are founded at this moment, okay? It was never a democracy which was established as something that was inclusive. All right, which was established as something that was going to mean that everyone was going to have equal opportunity. It was not that kind of democratic moment. And so we see by 1750, when we have 100,000 black people who are now enslaved in Virginia, that this notion, and 20 years before the American Revolution, and every colony now has enslaved people, all of the 13 colonies. We can really see that this growth in the limited aspect of democracy really does paralyze the growth in slavery. Okay, it's remarkable how these two things kind of develop and increase at the same time. It's also frightening to think of that as well. But I think 1619 is also forgotten, that this is the year 1619, 1620, I believe, that they decide to bring over the white women. Okay? So it's not just that we have the beginning of the General Assembly and the first Africans, but it's also a decision made that these white male settlers should not be marrying indigenous people, okay? They should not be connecting with people outside of the English Isles. And so there was an effort made to bring over white women specifically to marry white men. And so I just want to also introduce that discussion into our conversation, because there's a decision that, you know, patriarchy is going to be developed here, it's going to thrive, it's going to be a patriarchal system in which white men and white women create the legitimate colonists in this settler colonial experiment, you know, and so that also develops at the time too.
It was actually, so the Virginia Company takes a huge loss. In today's current value, they probably lost $20 to $30 million from 1607 through to the end of the company period in 1624. So an enormous loss. The only profitable aspect of the company's efforts was the sale of the white women who were taken to Virginia in the early 1620s, because they were respectable young women, and we have the records of some of them.
The court records, you know, the court records after they arrived and have been there for a few years don't suggest that, but nonetheless, some I'm sure were.
Maybe a little bit less respectable, but at any rate, it was a conscious effort to recruit these young women, as you were saying, to marry English, the planters, and they were sold for 150 pounds of tobacco apiece to the highest bidder. It was stipulated that the young women should have their choice, so they wouldn't be forced to marry anyone. Well, again, 3,500 miles away, who's going to do the enforcing of...
And no family to protect you.
That's right. But,
right, so.
But yeah, it's they're not the first women to arrive in Virginia by any stretch. But and of course, then there were the women who arrived maybe 10 years before. But it's an important affirmation, I think, of the creation of family, local community, and another way of endorsing private property, which is something that comes in terms of a widespread distribution of private property. It also arrives in 1618, 1619, for the very good reason of giving planters security, those that could afford private property, to those lands taken from the Powhatan during this time.
So it sounds like whiteness, democracy, and slavery are all being formed in this moment in 1619, which makes this story far more complicated.
Yeah, and I think the racial stereotypes that underpin it, some are there, some have been there. This is a complicated issue, so I'm simplifying it really, but some have been around for 100 years, some 50 years, but some were being developed in situ, I think, at this time. And interestingly, as much in regard to Indian peoples, after a great uprising of Indian peoples, the Powhatan in 1622, which wiped out at least a third, maybe more, of the entire English colony, the racial invective that pours out of the Virginia Company and others is the kind of vocabulary there. You see it developing both towards Indian peoples and Africans.
And you see some of that before. I mean, even in the writings of John Smith, you see that, you know, he has, you know, sort of nice things to say about indigenous women, but not indigenous men, that they're lazy and, you know, they just sit around smoking pot all the time, and which was a big thing at the time, actually, and those kinds of things. So we begin to see that there's differences made, between the two very early on, and certainly in the drawings from that early period too, where you see indigenous people drawn to look very specifically different in many ways from white colonists at the time, and not just in terms of the clothing that they are either wearing or not wearing too.
Yeah.
But one of the things I think is really interesting now that I'm thinking about drawings is that this wonderful drawing of a plantation, a tobacco plantation, from either the 1660s or 1670s in Virginia. And the thing about this drawing, are you familiar with what I'm talking about? The one where they show the manor house, and then, okay, all right. Well, the thing about this drawing is that even though it is still largely white indentured servants at the time, none of them are shown in this drawing. Only Africans, men and women, are shown producing, drying the tobacco, cutting the tobacco, hanging the tobacco up, drying it, and all of that. So, certainly by that time, the notion of Africans working in this quote-unquote cash crop has imprinted on enough people so that this artist has decided to capture it,
And that probably reflects what, I think a lot of the latest scholarship is pointing to the fact that at least among the wealthiest of the colonists, the investment and interest in converting to African labor happens earlier
Right.
than we originally thought, right? That it really is already happening,
Right.
At least by the 1650s. So that notion that, that it's delayed until the 1670s, I think we're getting a sense that we can push that back a little bit earlier, even though there's not a formalized slave trade. But even that, it reflects the fact that English planters are wanting the British slave traders to come to them. They're just not a big enough magnet
Right.
in the Atlantic vis-a-vis Barbados and Jamaica. So it's going to take a while for them to convince slave traders that it is worth their while to bring whole cargoes all the way into the Chesapeake Bay instead of just going to Barbados and Jamaica. But it's not for lack of desire. And so the fact that if we can acknowledge that the wealthiest planters are really wanting to switch over to African slaves earlier than we previously thought, I think it makes things like this image already in the 1670s make a little more sense.
Yeah, because that image could have been from Barbados at that time period. It could have been from Barbados or from Jamaica or, Bahia, Veracruz, any of those places from that time period. So,
I wonder if we could shift the conversation to legacies. Professor Smallwood, you brought up legacies earlier. Can we identify the legacies of slavery in our society today? American society developed for about 250 years with slavery, with racial slavery at the core of our society. How has that shaped the world in which we live today? And it doesn't have to be you.
Obviously, that's something we could...
It's a big question.
It's a big question. I think one thing I'll say pointedly to that is, and it's something that I was struck by, I was listening to you talk, Brenda, is that, the legacy, among other things, is race and racial inequality. Because I think one of the things that I won't say we circled around it, I think you brought it home, Ed. This was the creation of whiteness as much as it was the creation of blackness, particularly, for instance, the decision that we need white women, we don't want English men marrying African or indigenous women, or let alone marrying, just having sexual unions and producing children who are of mixed parentage. So there is an understanding of wanting to create a kind of endogamous white society, right? And I think things like that, things like the fact that representative government was, that experiment was itself dependent on such strict exclusions, goes a long way to helping us understand how it is that 100 years later, we have people who are starting to question slavery, Jefferson quite famously, who simultaneously presume that if we do decide to do something about slavery to end it, that then the problem becomes, so then what are we going to do with the black people?
Exactly. Yep.
In other words, one of the hardest things to teach in our classrooms today is that being anti-slavery did not mean being anti-racist
Just,
at
right, yep.
all.
Nope. Right.
From the era of the Revolution on into the era of the Civil War, and it is part of the reasons why things like the Revolution and the Civil War played out the way that they did, and the reason that we live with these legacies to this day, that this is a society that has yet to wrestle with the question of, are we okay with free black people, right? Black freedom is the thing that became anathema
Right.
in colonial North American, British North American society. So yeah, I would say that's one of the ways in which the history of slavery goes a long way to helping us understand the racial inequality and how persistent and intractable it is to this day.
And I wanted to, well, my students ask me this all the time, and so I think about it with regard to the law. I think about it with regard to the criminal justice system, and not just the 13th Amendment. But if we look at, for example, the Barbadian Slave Code of 1661, it's part of the British Empire. Virginia is impacted by that. South Carolina will be certainly impacted by it, etc. What does that slave code say? It says that, first of all, if any black person harms a white person, they can be killed. They can be killed, period, without worry of being themselves arrested, sentenced, etc. It says that. Google it, look it up. Secondly, it says that because black people are beneath English people, they are not to have the same system. They are not to be tried by a jury, for example, of their peers, okay? So they're establishing right there in law 2 separate legal systems, 2 separate judiciary systems, which we see go all the way through till we get to the 14th Amendment, all right? But once we get to the 14th Amendment, it's a few years later that Reconstruction ends, and we have this problem all over again. So fast forward to today. Hashtag Black Lives Matter. Hashtag say her name. This is all about inequality in the criminal justice system. It is all about people thinking that they can harm black people or people of color or poor people, etc., and get away with it. You know, all they have to prove is that I felt that you were going to harm me. You know, the ways in which our juries operate, the ways in which our special prosecutors operate, the ways in which our judges operate, etc. You know, so it's had a lasting imprint. Okay, the notion that black people are inferior and that black people therefore do not deserve to be equal under and in the law.
I'd like to give a particular example, actually, that really picks up on those themes. If you come to Jamestown, to the original site on an island, you will see lots of monuments, a lot of them built somewhere around 1906, 1907, and all praising, there's one that I often stand in front of. It's 104 feet tall. It's an obelisk. And it praises the bravery, the courage of the first English settlers. Well, I'm English, so I stand there and read that, shed a tear or two. But there are all these monuments to white people. There's one monument, statue, and I bet everyone can guess, young Indian woman, Powhatan, or Pamunkey woman. And we have one of the famous Pocahontas. Her hands reach out as if in supplication to the people who come through the gate at Jamestown. And they're within reach of children and adults, and they're polished to bright, it's a bronze statue, they're polished to bright golden color. However, there are no statues, no monuments, no indication of the African and African-American presence. And yet, from 16 19 all the way through to the end of the Civil War and emancipation, all the way through Jim Crow, all the way through segregation in Virginia, massive resistance and so on. There were Africans and African Americans living on Jamestown Island. We call it on the island 246. 246 years of slavery, and then what follows. We also have at Jamestown a site that we've just been working on, archaeological excavations, at a site where one of those very first Africans lived. Her name was given as Angela. It's obviously not her real name, African name, but it was given to her either by the Portuguese or English as Angela. And she lived on a small town lot that belonged to one of the wealthiest planters of the time in the 1620s. We know a lot about her background, and we've heard about origins in Angola and Cabasa, wherever she was from. All we know about her in Virginia is that she was living on this plantation in 1624 and 1625. That's when her name is given, only as Angela. We are doing the excavation partly to see if we can find out more about the environment that she would have lived in, she would have experienced. Not far from the James River. She may have gone down to the banks of the river when the ships came in. She certainly probably wouldn't have been working in the fields. There wasn't a tobacco plantation. She was living with 3 other indentured servants and the family. That's all we know. We don't know anything else about what happened to her. But what we do know is the struggles that she'd been through on that horrific journey all the way from her hometown, and it probably was a town, if not city, right, in Angola, all the way through the Middle Passage, being captured by privateers and being brought to Virginia and then enslaved. And we also know that she was one of the first. We call this project First Africans. Of course, First Africans to English America. There'd been more than a century in Spanish America, but for English America, First Africans. We believe she was enslaved, as we believe that all of the first Africans were enslaved. And we believe that although it will take time to develop, this is the beginning of slavery. This is the beginning of race, which means that we've had 400 years of race and racial discrimination in this country. And then the question is, how do we process that? How do we deal with it? We know the consequences. It's a long history. How do we tackle it? How do we admit to ourselves that, in actual fact, Americans, and I count myself one of them, have been and always have been a very diverse people. Diversity is in our collective DNA. And yet, different peoples have had such different treatment that inequality, race and inequality, I would gauge as one of the greatest contemporary challenges, not only of American society, but elsewhere around the world. That's what we've got to confront.
Are there any positive legacies?
Sorry, I sucked the oxygen out of the air with that declaration.
Well, I think the positive thing, one of the positive things that's come out of 1619 is that Black people from the very beginning helped to make the United States, what became the United States, a place in which people sought freedom, in which people sought equality. You know, from the first, people say, when did resistance start? I said, from the first African. From the first African who wouldn't get on the ship, who refused to be captured, ran away once they were captured, helped other people to escape. There is a the longest and deepest history of freedom seeking from the moment of enslavement and even before, seeking freedom. And if we're looking at Black people who are invested in marriage, who are invested in just, getting back, going back, returning, who were invested in suing for their freedom, who were invested in trying to fight during the American Revolution so that they could gain their freedom, trying to escape to Florida, up through those people who even decided that they would rather go back to Liberia through the American Colonization Society, those people who fought in the War of 1812, the Civil War, doing Reconstruction, who were in the Congress during Reconstruction period, and then on into, fighting lynching, et cetera, helping to establish those Civil War or Reconstruction amendments, and all the way through the Civil Rights Movement until we get to our hashtag moments of today. Those persons who came as Africans did not accept their enslavement, did not accept enslavement, period, and really fought and have kept America's eye on the ball of freedom and equality. And I think that's really an important positive legacy of us being here, even though we've done it through enormous, in the face of enormous resistance, institutionalized resistance in almost every institution that makes this country.
I think Professor Blight mentioned that maybe true hope comes out of tragedy. And I think that in all those forms of resistance, all those forms of non-acceptance of being commoditized, of being seen as a piece of property, out of those examples across the years, across the centuries, it gives hope to other peoples in this country, and I think this is what you're saying actually around the world, because just as we typically talk about fighting for our freedoms, fighting for our liberties, what would be wrong to highlight and celebrate and fight for our diversity as a people? That's clearly the direction not just American peoples, all peoples are heading in. And if we look to some of the very recent genetic studies, ancient DNA, studies being done, and we're engaged in those also, you actually realize that we know race is a social construction, but you actually do realize that people have always been, many peoples have been diverse. It's the rarity is to find a so-called pure people. And if they are a so-called pure people, genetically there's something very wrong, probably. I won't elaborate on that, but it seems to me that people have been moving for hundreds of thousands of years, and people have been intermarrying, having sex, enjoying themselves, working and playing and living alongside others. And I think it's particularly important, I'm going to get a little bit political here, but particularly important that this message gets across today, because in some ways we are going in the wrong direction at the moment. History isn't linear, or progress isn't linear, and we have to recognize that.
Yeah, I think what I would say is very much in keeping with the spirit of what my what do we call ourselves?
Conversationalists
have said. I think the positive legacy is to embrace the tough questions that this history presents to us. To embrace the tough question of what does it mean that the conditions of possibility for the initial experiment in representative government was so dependent on the exclusions of indigenous dispossession and racial slavery, because that means that we have the opportunity to reject that. But I think that's why now is the time to tell these stories in new ways, to tell the story of African American history in its twinned relationship to the story of Native American history, for instance, as I tried to stress earlier. That's the opportunity, that's the power of history. The facts don't change. It's the stories that we tell about them.
That's true, yep.
And so as we ask ourselves, what does this mean to us? The opportunity is to say, well, what's the different story that we need to tell out of these facts that, we've known for quite some time, to reject and to create and invent an entirely new vision of what freedom, what democracy might mean.
Well said. Questions? Let's open it up. You all must have some questions for the panelists. Right back here. Do we have mics? Or just use your voice? We do have mics.
Thank you for having this panel, first of all. So my school recently, I go to the University of New Haven, we recently had a Black Guns Matter event, basically on like Second Amendment, Black persons' use of it. And I'm not for the Second Amendment really, but at the same time, I really do feel like there's a difference between how Black people historically have tried to bear arms with the Second Amendment and white people bearing arms. So obviously throughout history, white people have been more violent, and when Black people have tried to, there's been like a big resistance against it. So I was wondering if you guys could touch on, Black revolts. So yeah.
So your question deals with the Second Amendment and the bearing of arms, correct? Well, most Black people up until past the Civil War were not allowed to own weapons. That's one of the things that you see very early on in the colonial period of Black people being excluded from being able not only to have firearms, but also to have things like knives and things that could be used in bludgeoning. And so, and this is because people realized that Black people did not want to be enslaved or oppressed. And if you had weapons, then you would fight against it. I mean, that's one of the reasons why Black people are not early on led into fight for the American Revolution on the side of the Patriots, for example, because there was a great fear that these people would rise up, particularly in Virginia and South Carolina, other places where they had large percentages of enslaved populations, and they would take their own freedom. And so the Second Amendment, in terms of arming people so that in militias particularly, so that they could fight against invasion, they could fight against, the British and other, again, in War of 1812 and during the time of the American Revolution too, is right, that part of the Constitution really does not deal with African Americans. It is not meant for African Americans. It is meant for white males who are going to, quote unquote, protect society from invasion, but also, of course, if you extend that, that's invasion by Black people who were enslaved, who are seeking their freedom too. So there's a long history of difference with regard to the Second Amendment and African Americans, and that's, begins in that early period and extends until today.
Another way to kind of come at that question, because you also asked about Black Revolt. And of course, the most important Black Revolt was the Saint-Domingue, the revolt of the slaves of Saint-Domingue that produced the independent Black Republic of Haiti. And, counterfactual questions are always complicated, but it's important to remember that antebellum and Southern slavery, the way that it expanded, after France pulled out of the Americas and sold Jefferson the Louisiana Territory, after the development of cotton cultivation, it wasn't dying anytime soon, right? And it's not an accident that it took such an extraordinarily destructive civil war to bring it to a close. And it's important to remember how much the Haitian Revolution played a role in that, not just because it produced the Louisiana Purchase, but because it produced the threat of what happens when black people revolt. The fear that was struck into American slaveholders, Americans across the board. Either the decision that this is why we need to go ahead and do something about slavery, or the reason that we need to double down and tighten the grip on slavery. The Haitian revolt had reverberations across the Circum-Caribbean that I think we're only just beginning to really appreciate. And so that tells us something about how important black revolt was, and that it shaped the history, and it arguably hastened, right, the production of black freedom, the abolition, the ultimate abolition of slavery.
Professors, I'm curious as to what took place in terms of communication and language. I think a lot of that is oftentimes missing in terms of what happened early on in 1619. I'm very curious. One thing I always stress so often to people who do study this era or are interested in this era, and since really up until abolition, is the fact that, you know, West Africa is very diverse in terms of language and in terms of culture. And so I can only imagine what the early beginnings were in terms of actual communication and language. So I'm curious in terms of what did take place for those few years, and how long did it take for those first arriving Africans to arrive here to have an understanding of the language in the first place, just English in general, let alone the complications that are coming from so many different lands. Thank you.
You know, that's a question that, I mean, I think the answer to that, I think the answer to that question needs to be put in the context of how complex the slave trade was, and I guess that's the point you alluded to about, you know, mentioning the diversity of the languages, but by the same token, you know, when you think about the fact that West Central Africa was such a huge, exponentially large contributor of the majority of Africans crossing the Atlantic, you know, until, you know, well into the 17th century, when the English then began to really develop slave trading literally all along the African coast. That, for instance, might tell us something about what the early foundational generations experienced, which is not to say that West Central Africa is singular. You know, there are multiple languages, but people were, you know, multilingual. There were lingua francas. So I don't know that it was always as impossible as we might sometimes imagine for people to find commonality and to find lingua francas. So that's one way I would answer that question.
I want to just piggyback off of what you said, Professor Smallwood, because we do have people coming from specific groups, but also groups that who are fairly close geophysically or spatially to each other initially, and they share similar languages, or they understand these languages. We do know that people do seek out speakers of their own language, and we see this happening in fugitive slave advertisements, for example, when people are described as having the same language. We do also know, though, that the languages began to change very early on to become creolized, a creolized language that many people or peoples can understand. This happens, you know, probably at the beginning of the forts where Africans are, the barracoons, and certainly during Middle Passage, too. So along with seeking out people who can speak your same language is also this process, this very rapid process of fueled by the great need and desire to communicate, to try to find common words, common syntax, et cetera, to be able to communicate with one another. And so we see these pockets of creolized languages, and even some largely extant African languages in Jamaica, for example, or look at the Sea Islands, South Carolina and Georgia, et cetera, in some places in Brazil, particularly in maroon societies. But Africans are working very, very hard to be able to communicate with one another. Those who are, you know, there are some people who are at war with each other, and we know that from the work that the people have done from South Carolina and other places too, so that everyone's not trying to communicate, but large numbers of people have the desire and the need to communicate. And we also see the English language changing too, and becoming creolized to a certain extent. And so we have visitors complaining about how, Europeans or the English are quote lip-syncing African tongues, etc., and African words or at least creolized words and forms of language are floating into the English language too. So, and I'm certain that there is some influence by indigenous peoples as well. And so there's a lot of language exchange that's going on, fueled by this great desire of, particularly by the people who are captured, to be able to communicate with other captives so that they can find a way out of their captivity.
And I think, to that point, it's important to first remember that the languages of the colonizers, in that sense, are both tools of oppression, but then also tools of resistance by people who know that they need to communicate. And if Portuguese or English or French becomes, even though it's the colonial language, if it can become the language that they can share, that it can also be a tool of resistance, especially as it's Africanized and used for the purposes and the needs of an enslaved community, and not just as a tool of oppression from the planter class.
And as Professor Smallwood said, most Africans are multilingual. They were at the time they spoke at least 3 languages.
Most people are
right?
multilingual,
Not us, because
us.
we. I mean, us at Yale. And so learning language is not something which is thought of as I can't do that. But we do see older people, too, who go into the trade, and their grandchildren or whatever may say they never spoke the language, they didn't speak it well enough, they could not communicate. We see Africans we have the few memories of Africans who arrived, suffering over the notion that they had no one to communicate with, to talk with, seeking out people they desperately want who spoke their language, who worshiped in the same way that they did, who had the same ideas about life and living that they did. So we see this desperation, this great need to be able to communicate in all kinds of ways. Of course, communication also came in the form of dance, of music, of dress, of ritual, too.
Thank you for coming. Greatly appreciate it. The slave patrol started in the mid-1700s in South Carolina. I'm just wondering if you could talk about how those policies and practice are still relevant today in terms of where we're at.
Slave patrols?
Slave patrol.
Well, I mean, there's been surveillance. There was surveillance of Africans as well as of English indentured as well as indentured people from the very beginning. So we might think about it as occurring in one particular colony and happening at a particular year, but from the very beginning we see this happening. And Middle Passage, and Professor Smallwood knows this much better than I do, but much of the personnel that we see on the ships are for patrolling, for surveillance, for making sure people do not communicate with one another, that they're not able to plot, etc. And even then, we see at least one slave revolt. I think people have averaged about 1 per month or something during the length of this very long trade. The term patrol and what that means may have, the term may have developed during the time period that you speak to in of South Carolina famously because it has more Africans than Europeans, and it's known for that, although many of the, if you look at the Chesapeake too, you'll find many of those early counties also had more Africans than Europeans. But of course, they were developed to control the movement of African people, of enslaved people from one plantation to the other, to keep people from running away, to keep people from meeting and planning revolt or resistance. And so this kind of surveillance of the other, whether you're indigenous, whether you're African, whether you're poor white, whether you're of one ethnic background or European background than the other was there from the very beginning of the colonial project, and was a big piece of the slave trade and of slavery. Of course, it then came into the period of Reconstruction, but particularly post-Reconstruction, where you see, in 1867, around that period at any rate, the beginning of the KKK, which all these night riders is part of the night rider movement, the beginning of these curfews, what we now still call sundown towns, et cetera. So we've seen this just kind of carry through the 20th century. We also have policing that's specific to communities of color, whether you're looking at the East Coast, the West Coast, the South, or the North, or the Middle, too. And we still see additional policing per person in communities of color. And so, and in almost every way that you want to see it. We used to have a running joke when I was a student at Yale, and I love Yale, okay? But you could not go into the co-op without having some person following you all around the co-op, period. Okay, and so policing on almost every level, every way where you go. So it begins in the beginning, and I don't think it's any different for what happens in the United States or what was the British colonial project versus the French, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Spanish, etc.
I mean, I think this speaks to, and in some ways this is just repeating some of the things we've said, but I do think this speaks to the fact that we need to really remember how much colonial slavery in the Americas was something new. There's a way in which we like to talk about the fact that slavery is, trans-historical, it crosses all time periods, every society has had slavery. Well, that depends on what you mean by the word slavery. And colonial slavery is not just property and people. It's not just forced labor. It is a draconian system of control. When you are using slavery to produce colonial wealth, right, to produce a colonial society, and that's why I think it's important for us to really take colonialism seriously, not just to kind of see it as a kind of temporality, the time period that anticipates the teleological inevitable emergence of a nation state, but that colonizing is a really violent thing to do.
Yeah.
And so, it's not an accident, as we've alluded to, that one of the most significant, persistent, constantly reinventing and recreating ways that colonial slave societies across the Americas produced laws was to control people, control slaves, control indigenous people, control indentured servants in the societies that had indentured servants, because that was the thing that constantly had to be maintained. I mean, there's a reason why slave codes have, I haven't counted a percentage, but a huge percentage of the sort of bullet points in any of the big slave codes is about one way or another controlling enslaved people, where they can meet, where they can move, where they can't move, whether they can't have weapons, they can't marry, they can't do this, they can't do that. It's a regime of control. And so when we ask ourselves, what's the legacy, it shouldn't surprise us that we still struggle with questions about racial disparity, a kind of pegging and indexing, a racial indexing, right, in our purportedly free post-emancipation society that's about control, because that's how the society was created, was born.
Good evening. I have a question. I'm sorry. I have a question here. First, good evening. I want to thank Dr. James and the Afro-American Studies Department, as well as the Afro-American Culture Center, and Ms. Reese Nelson, as well as everybody else responsible for this program, Reverend Care for hosting this here at this church, and to all my neighbors and friends here from Greater New Haven who came out tonight to be a part of this. So my question is this, to the panel. You mentioned the law and the criminalization of black men and black women. 1640, can you comment on 1640, the John Punch case, N-Ray Punch? It was documented, as you may recall, John Punch was an African and who was an indentured servant in Virginia. He escaped with two other indentured servants, two Europeans. They all three were captured, brought before the governor's council. The two Europeans, their indentured servitude was extended by a few years, and they were given 40 lashes. But John Punch was given servitude for life.
Right.
The first documented case in America where race was considered and actually utilized in terms of administration of justice. So my question to the panel is, can you comment on the impact that the John Punch case had then in colonial Virginia and perhaps in other colonial institutions at during that period of time, and how it actually impacts on life today in America? Just a question.
Okay. You want to take this?
Well, again, a big question, but I would say what's struck me in giving this, looking at 1619 and reflecting upon its significances, is just how central race has been in inequality. And when you look at, you take any of those laws, I think we're arguing that, well, at least I am, that slavery existed before John Punch, that as soon as the phrasing was of the 20 and odd was that they were bought. Mm-hmm. They were bought for victuals. That was what it said, and I take that literally, that these, we're not dealing here with indentured servants who served a particular length of time. There were some Africans, first Africans, who did gain their freedom, but they're the exception, in my view. And they tended to serve 35, 40 years before they had that opportunity. So what I see is a pretty aggressive planter class, and the point's been made already. The wealth is based on two things: land. Land is taken from Indian peoples, and labor. Labor could be cheap English white labor, but increasingly it was black labor. So that is what is one of the, or two of the key factors behind inequality. There's a book I read, which I rather enjoyed, if that's the right word, probably not, called Toxic Inequality, and really gives you an understanding. It's about today, about right now, but it shows just how persistent the inequality has been over the centuries. And I think that is the lesson that we need to take away and we need to address.
I just want to, with regard to your specific question, though, I would like to add that we do see early on two differences in sentencing of people based on their gender, but particularly based on their racial identity. And so John Punch is a really excellent case. If you continue to look through the legal courts, the records of the legal courts during the time period, you would see that there are distinct differences made between people who are white and people who are black with regard to the length of time they will serve or the kind of punishments they will have. This carries over when we look at the sentencing even today, who is, first of all, arrested, secondarily, what they're charged with, the severity of the charge or not, and the amount of time in prison that they are received and the kinds of prisons that they go to. And now we have enough data to also understand that this does not just happen with regard to the criminal justice system, but if we look at the ways in which children are policed in schools, from preschool forward, we will see that the kinds of punishments that children receive also can be aligned with their race, their gender, and their class. Too. So this John Punch is just really the beginning of when we see these differences as they play out, not only in, the kinds of things that you are accused of, who's accused, and every aspect of the criminal justice system, but particularly sentencing.
Just a very quick footnote, if I may, to that. There's been some recent research done that pushes that date back from 1640 to About
Even early?
1625, yeah, by Paul Halliday, a legal scholar at UVA. Again, that absolutely makes that point. I just wanted to put that in.
I know there's more questions, but I'm afraid we're out of time. So please join me in thanking our panelists.